Hola Chicas! Welcome to 20 Questions With, a podcast in conjunction with Latinitas Magazine. Latinitas Magazine is a strong voice for Latina and POC youth, which is why the host of 20 Questions With are all young Latinas who are looking to gain experience in innovative and creative fields just like you. In each episode, you'll hear from striking individuals who are inspiring today's youth with their passion, motivation, and grit. Today, join me, Elisa Garcia, and volunteer writer Dana Garibaldi while we sit down and ask 20 questions with producers Estefania, Bonilla, Hernandez, and Craig Whitney of the Red Note podcast. The Red Note podcast is a 10-episode podcast series hosted by investigative journalist Lydia Cacho. The show follows the stories behind the femicides in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. The podcast is the first fully bilingual podcast with complete episodes in both English and Spanish under the title La Nota Roja. Both the Red Note podcast and La Nota Roja were written and directed by Craig Whitney with Estefania as the lead producer. We had an amazing time talking with both Estefania and Craig, and they were able to walk us through some valuable information about the femicides. With that said, this episode will be divided into two parts for our listeners. Thanks for joining us on this episode of 20 Questions With. I'm Dana, and I'm here with my co-host Elisa, and we're here with today's guests Estefania and Craig, who are part of the Red Note podcast, which investigates the numerous femicides in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Well, hi everyone, and I'm going to be kicking off with the first half of the questions. So I always like to know everybody's, like, when people come on the show, their background. So can each of you kind of walk us through your career background and how each of you guys came to be part of the Red Note podcast team?
I worked for about 3 years as a journalist in college at the University of Connecticut and a couple years at the University of Texas. After graduation, I made a couple short films, one of which called The Garden in the Wilderness won an award from the Houston Film Commission and as one of the year's best Texas-made short films. And so after receiving that award, I started thinking about wanting to do my first feature film, and I decided I wanted to make a film about the femicide in Ciudad Juarez. I started working with Estefania on that about 3 years ago, and as we were looking for financing for the film, had the opportunity to make the podcast. So that's how we got to this point.
I have a major here in Mexico in ethnohistory by the National School of Anthropology and History here in Mexico City. So all the social issues and themes and everything, it's always been something that I've been always too drawn to. I also studied ethnohistory with the means of going to filmmaking. So I began doing a lot of work as production coordinator for some big movies like Transformers 5 or Everything for MGM Studios, and also for Mexican productions here in Mexico, obviously. Working with those production houses here in Mexico, we met with Craig through a friend in common that we have, that right now it's the editor. It's the editor that we want to be for the movie. And that's how we began to work together 3 years ago till this day, trying to find the financing, and in all that journey we got to do the podcast.
That's amazing. And both of you mentioned that you had prior experience to or knowledge about the femicides going on. So, and, in filmmaking, and then it led to the podcast. So what was it that inspired you and drew you to the story, and how that led to, making the Red Note?
Well, what inspired me initially were a song by an El Paso rock group called At the Drive-In about the story of the disappeared women. And I heard that for the first time in 2002 and just thought it was a really wonderful piece of literature about a really important story. And I remember kind of giving some thought about maybe I would write a poem about it or something at that time, but I never really did. But about 10 years later, when I was thinking about what I would do my first feature film about, I read 2666, the novel by Roberto Bolaño, which is also about the femicide. And I remember reading that book and just thinking that, I mean, you know, when you're thinking about what you want to make a movie about, there are all different criteria. I mean, it has to be like a dramatic story because you want to make an interesting movie. But for me personally, the fact that it also ties in with so many very complicated social forces that gave rise to the femicides, it appealed to me on a lot of different levels as a potential story. Over the next several years, I read dozens of books and many hundreds of articles and did interviews and just tried to learn a lot about it for the script. So when we were presented with the opportunity to do the podcast about a year ago, I had already done a lot of research about it. I don't think it would have been possible to get it done in the time that they wanted to get it done in if there hadn't been a 5 or 6 year lead in from all the work that Estefania and I did going to Juarez and researching. And those are the things that inspired me.
Well, in my case, it wasn't not a lot of thing of an inspiration because I'm more like on the production side. So my responsibility is like to always take the director and try to always protect the creativity and the vision that this person has for a story. In my particular position as a producer, maybe I go into like being the creative part, like being somebody who can verify the information. So there was a lot of things that Craig obviously during his research was reading from people from the US and researchers from the US that sometimes got some things wrong because they didn't have like this feeling about living in a culture and some meanings around symbols, around attitudes, around things that obviously that's something that you only have when you leave the place and you live between these people. So in my case, it was more a job to help Craig to craft in a more specific and in a more accurate way how to bring out the story that he wanted to tell. And obviously, because of the nature of the subject, you know that right now here in Mexico since, well, a lot of time, but it's getting a lot of attention, like from 2 years ago. For some reason, this thing kind of exploded. And all these feminist movements that already here in Mexico have been like gaining a lot of attention and they have been growing from inside out in various ways. I was like that vehicle that Craig could use to navigate through that kind of subtle circumstances or subtle elements that you need to have to understand the complexity of this story.
Thank you guys for sharing that. My next question was, what's the story behind the Red Note title? Who came up with it? How did that idea come to be?
The film had a different title when I wrote the first version of it. As time went on, I felt like it wasn't the right title for the film. So I started keeping a list of other titles and just things I read in books. And I think on the one hand, it sounds good. It sounds like the name of a movie, which is kind of seems kind of dumb, but it's also kind of important because it's a commercial product, even if some of the elements. But also, you know, one of the things we talk a lot about in the podcast is the systemic nature of the gender violence in Juarez and in other parts of Mexico and other parts of Latin America, that the femicides happen because of an interplay between drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, globalization, machismo, corruption in the government, infrastructure problems in Ciudad Juarez. And so it felt like a title that alluded to the systemic nature of the problem rather than being, there's a serial killer loose in Ciudad Juarez and we have to track him down. I feel like a lot of times these really horrific acts of violence that happen in Mexico or other parts of the world. They're just exploited for entertainment value. It's disappointing the way that these really horrific acts of violence are used to sell newspapers or not really examined with the kind of depth that they need to be. You know, there are, like in Juarez, there's a newspaper called PM, and like all the kind of yellow journalist newspapers in Mexico, there's almost always, you know, a dead body on the front, there's a soccer player on the back, and if you open up to the middle, there's a lady in a bikini. I mean, there's usually not much more analysis of this body that is photographed on the street other than the kind of shock value of these horrific acts of violence. And I felt like what we wanted to do in the film was to examine the parts of this person's life that, you know, that there's more to this person's life than them being shot 5 times in the street, that they have a family and that they have friends and jobs, and there are complex social forces that were behind their murder, and to only investigate it with the complexity of a, you know, bloody photo and an exploitative headline. We've talked a lot amongst ourselves about how the victims become re-victimized after their deaths. It was kind of a way to acknowledge that we hoped that the film was going to be a much more sensitive and in-depth look at some of these events that are taking place along the border than what is often presented in the media in various forms.
Well, Craig was the one who came up with the title of the Red Note. Here in Mexico was kind of controversial between the people that always like knew the project and everything, because the Red Note always have this very negative connotation, as Craig says, of very exploitive images. People being shot at, of people being murdered, or people dying in a very weird ways. And it's more in this sense of selling a lot of newspapers and selling this like very horrid kind of imaginary around death. For a lot of the people here in Mexico always read the title, or even the families, when we were like telling them that they ask like what is going to be called, and we tell them La Nota Roja, the Red Note. For them was like, why? No, and it always has like this kind of impact here in Latin America. But I do understand the reason why. It's kind of like you are reimagining that concept into a new thing. It's like a contraposition. I mean, we're doing completely the opposite, or at least we try to do completely the opposite. So you always do like this contraposition between this very horrid and imaginary and very graphic around these kind of subjects towards something that we wanted like to talk about it as in a more human and in a more social and in a more serious and complexity and all the context that it's around this kind of things that are going on. And even with that explanation and everything, there's a lot of people that still hates the title. I can say that. No, but there's people that understand also like the nuances and all the idea behind like what we call in Spanish la reapropiación. No, like you reclaim for yourself something that it has a meaning, but you reclaim that for yourself to reimagine it in another way. So I do like that kind of exercise and that kind of experiment. Everybody has been reacting to it in a positive way more than in a negative way. Maybe because now it's gaining a lot of ears and it's getting a lot of attention and it's getting like, and everybody it's like leaning into how come, because that's the other thing. It's a title that everybody, like your eyes concentrate and fixate on that. It's something that capture your attention, and when they go into it and they hear it and everything, it's like, oh, okay. That's been really interesting. That's one of the interesting things about this project. We will see how this experiment goes.
But I think that was exactly the intention, was that everybody reacts to it, right? It's not like calling the story Las Muertas de Juarez or something like that, which is what every newspaper article ever written about this subject is called. And I think that as you hear about a famine going on in another part of the world or a genocide taking place in another part of the world, for a lot of people, their eyes glaze over and they don't really connect to it with the diligence and care that stories like that require. I think it's good that it gets a reaction from people because people have heard this story before in many cases. Getting them to look at it with fresh eyes is important. The title is one way that we can get an apathetic audience member to sit up and pay attention.
Thank you, guys, for sharing. I think both of you kind of touched on a point that I think pops up a lot when a new true crime documentary or podcast comes up. A lot of the critiques from a lot of them nowadays is like, oh, well, it only focuses on the victims or what happened to them after death and not so much the person. So I think that's actually one of the questions we get to later on in the episode. So I'm really glad that you guys touched on it beforehand. So can't wait to dive into that more. Another thing that I wanted to know is what does the process look like? Putting together an episode, publishing it. I know briefly you guys said that the past year you've been working on it, and this past year has been pandemic and virtual. So what did that look like for you guys?
Well, we signed the agreement to do the podcast in November of 2019. I started working on the scripts right away. I had to write all the scripts about 60 days, so that was a lot of work. But I finished first drafts of them before we went to Ciudad Juarez, and then we went there with our production team last February and spent about 3 weeks there doing interviews with families of the victims and journalists and investigators and members of the government. And we tried to get as broad a spectrum of perspectives on these murders as we possibly could. And then after those 3 weeks, we came back to Mexico City and then the pandemic started. So as we were heading into the post-production process, we were also dealing with adjusting to the new pandemic reality. Well, I had to finish the script. So I did another 30 days of writing after we got back. And Estefania and the translators were transcribing all the interviews while I was working on the scripts so that I could incorporate those into the revised versions of the scripts. And then I think in about April, we went into the studio with Lydia. And Lydia was reading all these scripts and sending us notes, giving us a lot of stories, because she was a reporter in the 90s that was covering this. So she had all these anecdotes about, oh, yeah, I talked to that guy in 1998 and here's what he told me. And those were fantastic because it really helped put her stamp on the material. We tried to carve out as much space for her to put stories in there and to give me notes and change things. So there was a lot of revision we did with her and went into the studio for about a week and a half in April, which was really arduous because we had to do them all over Zoom calls. I was here in Mexico City listening to the recording sessions over Zoom. So I was doing 10-hour-long Zoom calls every day for about a week and a half, which was really tiring. And we finished those and then I started working with Javier Umpierrez, our editor, on putting together the edits of the episode, and then simultaneously working with our composer Michael Ramos in Austin to put the music together. We did first versions of those and sent them to Imperative in June, I think, and they sent us a bunch of notes back and we went through it one more time, made those revisions and turned in the final episodes. It was about 10 months from when we signed the contract until when the first episode premiered, which was a tight schedule, but we have a really amazing team. Not just the people who were editing or writing the music, but also Estefania did a really amazing job of making sure that we stayed on schedule and on budget. I can't speak as much to that because I was very in the weeds with the creative side of the podcast, but Estefania could speak more to the logistical coordination that went on during that whole time.
Well, it wasn't that big of a deal in terms of production, to be really honest. We signed this deal on November 19th. Between December and January, we had like all our pre-production. And then we had 3 weeks of interviews going to Juarez. And then we came back to Mexico City. The pandemic hit. And because it was post-production, I mean, it's a beauty living these times, to be honest. It's a beautiful thing having the internet and having Wi-Fi and having all this kind of new technology that you can have on audio and on video and things like that. So for example, with Javi Umpierres and all of them, and with our voiceover director, we use software like Source Connect. Like everybody could have their own headphones and just look a very silent corner on their houses to do all the voiceovers and everything. Lydia, during that time, she was in San Francisco, and we did rent a studio for her during a week so she could have like going in, doing all her lines, doing all her work. And the studio also had all this software that we had here in our studios here in Mexico City. And everything was through Dropbox and Google Drive and Source Connect and everything, and Zoom and Skype. I mean, it's a beauty. It's a beauty when you know like how to organize your time, how to organize the team and everything. And everything went really smoothly. I mean, I think that the only thing that maybe we had kind of a trouble was the transcripts, but the reason why it's because we had like 400 hours of interviews that we had to translate, and it was so much to transcript, to translate from Spanish to English, back and forth, and the note, correct, doing all like the scripts. Maybe that was the most chaotic and headache part of the entire process. But I mean, for example, the original music was done by Michael Ramos, and he lives in LA. So everything was through the internet and through all this amazing software that you can have. And we got to deliver the entire show, if I'm not wrong, between July and August. So it was like a 9 month of very disciplined and being very organized and just having like in a very clear way and in a very planned way. It's when, okay, you can do everything on time, in budget, and it was perfect. For me, I really didn't suffer that much. It's even more complicated to do a film, so I did enjoy it a lot, the process, to be honest.
I can totally attest to just being very blessed, and nowadays working with technology, especially working from home with no end in sight right now. So yes, love working from home. And you guys actually answered my next question, so y'all are on top of this. So my next question that I wanted to ask was, both of you already had expressed that you had prior knowledge and experience about the femicides going on. So my question, I'm going to kind of change it up a bit. Now that you're part of this team and you're coming in at it from the investigative point of view, what's a new fact that you learned that you didn't know prior to coming in that really just maybe you had to take a moment, or you kind of were like, whoa, like had no idea, or maybe was caught off guard? So what's something new that you learned after joining the Red Note team?
I think one of the best parts of the whole process for me was the friendships or relationships that we were able to establish with all the people that we got to meet. I think that it's a very different experience reading about what some of the families of the victims have gone through than it is to sit in the same room and listen to them talk about those experiences and imagine these people who are sitting in front of you having to contend with the kinds of things that they've had to contend with. So I think for me, that was the most impactful part of the production process, was going there and sitting down and having, in some cases, multiple interviews or really lengthy, in-depth interviews. And also it was really wonderful to get to spend 3 weeks in Ciudad Juarez doing the production, because we had a lot of time to just do a lot of really quotidian things. Every time I'd gone there before, we were always there for a reason, and it was a tight schedule, and we were trying to pack as much in as we could. And so, you know, to like go to a Burger King in Ciudad Juarez or something like that, as non-seismic as that sounds, I really enjoyed that aspect of the production process, just getting to like shop for groceries and do things like that and incorporate those quotidian textures of daily life into the podcast. And I mean, we're in a lot of ways, the podcast is very historical and very, you know, about the investigation over the course of 25 or 30 years. But as much as possible, we tried to incorporate those sensations and those vibes and those just firsthand observations that we gathered while we were in the city.
Well, in my case, I mean, the knowledge that I have around the subject, it was just my experience as a woman living in Mexico and living in Latin America. I was born in Colombia, and I had to also experience that. When I was 20 years old, I came to Mexico to live, and I've been living here, and now I have the double citizenship. And for me, the realities of Colombia and of Mexico obviously are kind of, I mean, it has their own specific things, culturally speaking, but it's kind of the same thing. And it's kind of the same aggressiveness and kind of the same difficulties, you know, around gender violence and everything. And even I'm privileged enough to had not to experienced a lot of very violent circumstances or situations because I had the tools and I have like the education like to not be inside that kind of violent surroundings, but that does not exempt me or gets me out of not experiencing a lot of aggressiveness or some kind of violence around. Very subtle, no? In Colombia, for example, I don't know why women are so obsessed of being thin and of looking spectacular as Sofia Vergara. I mean, Sofia Vergara is great and so good for her, you know, but we are not all Sofia Vergara. And it's not the same thing here in Mexico. In Mexico, it's more like they want to control you. Men are more like they want to control what do you do, who do you talk to, why do you do the things that you do, what are the decisions that you take. So that kind of experiences, for example, shows you, well, some particularities, but it's all of the same context. So that was my experience. Just being a woman and just being like someone who was born and raised here and had like to see all of this. Now, after joining the Red Note team, it's not that much of the team. It was more like knowing the families and meeting the families. There is where it was like the entire reality of, I mean, your bubble of privilege just exploded. That's when it makes it so difficult because then you confront yourself towards about your own privilege and also how other people has such a big kind of resilience. It's so big their generosity even with other people. Just talking to us about the most excruciating and the most difficult time and experience they had in their lives, that it's a daughter that disappeared or was murdered, you know? So it was really difficult. It was it was a difficult production to come into and a difficult show because you were talking about things where these people took you at somebody that they finally had somebody who was listening to them. I experienced that they always wanted like to get out all the darkness and all the sadness and all the frustrations, but you have to be mentally and anemically prepared to receive that. And that wasn't always easy. That always also remind you like a lot of your own demons and a lot of your own experiences. And obviously you come like to compare between what had happened to them and what had happened to you. And it's not the same thing and it's not the same reality. And you can see all the inequality between all of us. And that's something really hard to also absorb and like interiorize and to understand that we live very different worlds and we live in a very different contexts. I think that was the most rewarding and challenging circumstance of what it was joining the Red Note team. It wasn't that much of the team. It was of the families. It was going to Juarez and experience these kind of things. And they are only telling you. It's not like you experience it like on your own family or you saw somebody being murdered in front of your eyes or something like that. It's only hearing it and just feeling and sensing the entire energy around it. And that's enough like to just get you in the floor. And I think that was a very rewarding thing to experience. It was a really rewarding and eye-opening way to understand and to be grateful in life.
At the same time, though, I'm really glad that we were able to connect, especially with the families, more than just a interviewee level. I really enjoyed the fact that we got to talk with them before and after some of the interviews and laugh together. And I'm really glad that Elisa had the idea when we interviewed all the victims' families to ask if they could tell us a funny story about their daughter, or can you tell us more than just about the stories of their disappearances or deaths? Because again, it was really important to not just focus on that one worst day of their life, and to try and examine their stories with more complexity and empathy. And it was just really nice to be able to make a connection and not just to show up and do the interview and leave. I mean, I think that was something that really Alicia facilitated too, just because of her background as a journalist in Juarez.
Yeah, both of you guys bring up some like really great points. I know in journalism school, they teach you to be like really objective. And I feel sometimes it's really impossible to do that. Whether like you're a community reporter, like obviously you need to have a strong sense of the people you write about and you talk to. So Estefania, what you said was beautiful. And I'm pretty speechless that you guys were, kind of face to face with the inequalities that we all have between each other. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm kind of speechless with what you had to say there. And one of the things that I wanted to ask was, I know both of you guys have background in film and now you have the podcast. So what are other ways, or why is it important for people to bring awareness to this issue? How can people bring awareness to this issue outside media formats?
Well, the thing is that we are only a tool. I mean, the call to action has been made by the families and all the people that have had like this kind of empathy around these circumstances are the ones who are now activists, are the ones who are now feminist colectivos feministas, no? These feminist movements. And they have been the ones who have pushed for a lot of this kind of awareness around it. Now, we were given the possibility and the opportunity to have a platform that it was the podcast, and it wasn't just a little platform in a little podcast. It was a big podcast with a big platform with budget to do it. And I think that there is where you have to be really conscious that you now have a responsibility. No, as at least for me, if not as a filmmaker, because I know a lot of filmmakers who have tried like to address to this same subject and they do it so wrong and so terrible in terrible ways. No, but maybe one of the things that Craig and I had been like kind of fortunate to have is that at least I have this social anthropology and ethnohistory background, and he has this journalist background. So we know that ethics are important, and we knew that that kind of approaching into this kind of subject, we needed to do it like that. So having that in mind, media can do a lot to get consciousness and to get people the awareness and the information to understand these things are happening. I also think that why it's important to understand why these things in Juarez are important, it's because when you understand the entire complexity around all these murders and around all these disappearances, and now you understand it's also globalization, and you understand also it was NAFTA, and you understand also it was the, capitalism in this neoliberal way that we are right now like experiencing it, and this individuality that makes you think that maybe the way that you consume some things are affecting the lives and the economy of other people that are into this kind of inequality circumstances, and when you understand that kind of the background and how all these things develop, for example, one of our experts in the podcast says is that the sex trafficking is the second thing that gives to the cartels. I mean, it's the second most important business they have after the drug dealing and after the drug narco traffic. They transport these girls from Ciudad Juarez to Mexico City to Tijuana and then to San Diego and then to San Francisco, and then the trace is lost. So you begin to think, okay, so who are consuming these services or sex services of these girls? And then you understand that is the US, and then you understand that is Canada. There is where you begin to understand that this is also your fault and this is also your responsibility. And you have to be held accountable of that, you know? So the media, or at least this kind of platforms, this is what it helps. It helps like to understand what it's behind. It's not only that a girl was disappeared or a girl was murdered. It's all the things that it's coming behind all that kind of actions that then you just get this shock to the reality. And then you understand why is happening these things, and then you understand that maybe you are also part of the problem. And it doesn't matter that you live in Japan. And that's the other thing. This is not only a thing that happens in Juarez. I mean, the girls are disappearing in the US. The girls are disappearing in Indonesia. The girls are disappearing in Europe, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure that they're disappearing or they are being murdered with the circumstances and with the, I don't know, the characteristics of each culture and each society. But it happens, and it happens all the time. The thing is that Mexico had, in this case, like a very brave posture on this one, and they decided like to open up what it was going on, and they want to do something about it. So now maybe it's time for others to also gain that consciousness in their own surroundings and in their own contexts. And that's the thing why it's important to understand what is going on with the killings in Juarez, because it's not only in Juarez. Maybe it's happening around the corner of your own home.
Yes, I actually agree. What first brought me the attention of what was going on was a documentary that I saw on the Long Island serial killer, connecting everything that was going on in Juarez and along U.S. highways, and that it is a national problem. So 100% spot on. So yes, it is our fault and everyone's fault. For being that, like, consumerism, if you will. So I have been listening to the season, of course, and I know, like, the first episode, there's, like, gunshots in, like, the window and just some scary stuff going on. So I wanted to know what were some situations that maybe you kind of, like, just completely freaked out on or were really concerned for your own safety, the team's safety.
Well, yeah, that shooting incident that happened while we were recording the podcast was unpleasant for everybody and frightening, especially while it was happening. Afterwards, Elisa, who was doing all the interviews for the podcast, and Renix, who was our fixer, were able to go outside. They actually knew some of the journalists who were already on the scene, and they spoke with them, and they were able to kind of figure out what was going on, and that even though it was a scary situation, it didn't have any direct relation to what we were doing. And so that was good to hear, because obviously we wouldn't have stayed if anybody's safety was at risk. I'm glad that we were able to include that in the podcast, because I think it really viscerally illustrates to a listener, especially somebody who is not as knowledgeable about the history of Ciudad Juarez or the femicides, that there's a lot of danger lurking in that city, even at 2 p.m. in the center of downtown Juarez. Unfortunately, what we went through is really unexceptional for that city and for journalists in this country. I mean, Alicia, who did all the interviews, we talked with her later, and she told us all of these stories stories that we tried to include in the podcast about the number of shootings she witnessed during the cartel war in the early 2000s. We were inside a building and the building got shot at, and that was scary. But, compared to some of the things that she and other journalists in Juarez have gone through, I don't want to give myself a medal for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, which is essentially what happened. Fortunately, everyone was okay, and fortunately didn't have anything to do with us. But on the Richter scale of journalistic violence, unfortunately for Mexico, that doesn't rank very high.
Unfortunately, Mexico, yes, it has its own issues. And moreover, with journalism, we did had some concerns around safety with the crew, because that wasn't the only incident either. I mean, it was the only flashy incident that you have all the gunshots and everything, and in a very Hollywoody way of putting it. But the truth is that the narco knew we were there. A lot of people knew we were there, because with social media, everybody knew that we were doing questions and we were interviewing people. Some people even shouted out us when we were with Mr. Señor Castillo, with José Luis Castillo, that we were doing a shooting, because we went with a camera also, and we do we registered everything on video also. So we were following him, doing his sales of chocolate popsicles, because he does this, and somebody shouted at us, "Leave him alone!" And we were like, what happened? And then we knew, because of Renix, that it was some kind of a narcomenudista, somebody from the narco cells that knew him and everything, and they were trying to defend Mr. Castillo because they thought that we were exploiting his image for our own profit. The thing is that, you have to be smart. When you do these kind of things, it's not like this is the hell and you can't do things. That's not the message either, It's that you have to be smart. You have to be with the people that know how to move in the city, and and they know how to move and where to tell you, okay, now it's a good time to go, so go. No, right now you need to get there, just be over there and don't move. Let me handle this. And that's the reason why you have fixers. And that's the reason why we had Alicia and we had Renix. And that's the reason why the only flashing incident was that one. And then we had at least sparkles of, okay, we knew that we were in the social media from people from the city, and then we knew that some cars went towards us, and then they parked just behind us, and they asked us okay, so where is the school? But it's not that question. It was what are you doing here? We already knew how to answer to that kind of questions, how to act around that kind of situations and everything. It's not that you are always in fear. We couldn't do a show where we were on fear all the time. It's just to accept that that's the reality, and you have to adapt to the reality that you have and just try to make it work the best way you can. So yes, it's always a thing about the safety. It's always a thing about, okay, how are we going to tackle the production day of today? But if you're smart enough and you listen to the people who are the ones who know how to move inside the city and everything, unless you go with a very a nuance and in a very conscious way, that you are going maybe after somebody with name and surname, and then things can get heavier. And you can do that. And that's the reason why there's a lot of very brave journalists here in Mexico who have done that. They have done a lot of great things for this country, and now they are exiled, like Lydia Cacho, for example. The truth has to come out, and we have to talk about these kind of issues. So everybody is really conscious of the kind of country that we live in, and we just put up with it, and we just hope for the best, and we always do the best that we can. It's more the good people than the bad ones. That's a reality also. So we just move forward, and we try to make our world a better place, at least doing a podcast.
Thank you for sharing. And that kind of touches a little bit into the next question is, you talked a lot about safety and the safety precautions you guys took as a team. What do those safety precautions look like for families or young women in modern Juarez today, or Latin countries in general?
Well, one thing that you have to be like really conscious about is that what happens in Juarez is not the same thing as happens in Mexico State or in Veracruz or in Bogota or in Brazil, or it's not the same context and it doesn't move like the same way. But today, the maquiladoras and the factories still have some politics and still have some actions that goes against the labor rights, because that's the first thing that maybe we should like address. Maquiladoras and these kind of factories, they pay peanuts to their workers. So there are not labor rights over there. It's kind of an exploitative context of work and labor. And women in that case are in more disadvantage than men because of the gender, because of the history that we already have discussed all this time, because of another social facts. So I know for a fact that maquiladoras in Mexico and in a lot of industries around, throughout the entire country, throughout Mexico, they have been putting like a lot of rules or protocols to do inside the work environments more friendly to women and everything, because that's like the sense that it happens right now. But the truth is that in the practical ways right now, it's not coherent. It does not fit to the dynamics that they had before they put those rules or those protocols into action. So there's a lot of work to be done still in this modern Juarez. The truth is that unfortunately, women still killed, women still disappeared. And that's a reality that we have to face, and we will have like to go through it. And we are precisely, or as a country, we are taking a lot of consciousness that it is a problem, a very, very big problem that, as I say again, we had the bravery and we were too valientes to open this thing and say we do have a problem and we need to address to it. Now, there's a lot of mechanisms and there's a lot of laws that right now are being done to protect women towards violence digitally or even towards violent peers or violent partners they have or something like that. But there's a lot of work to be done still.
That was the end of my set of questions, and I'll go ahead and kick it off to Dana for the second half. If you're interested in pursuing a career in media, make sure to visit us at latinitasmagazine.org for more information. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode of 20 Questions With. We'll see you next time. Thank you for tuning in to part 1 of this episode. Go ahead and continue listening for part 2 to hear Dana's side of the interview.